Today we're going to talk about ICD-10-CM Chapter 10, the diseases of the respiratory system, the 2017 guidelines. There are instructional notes at the beginning of Chapter 10 that we need to pay attention to. The first one says when respiratory condition is described as occurring in more than one site and is not specifically indexed, it should be classified to the lower anatomic site, and the example that's given to us is tracheobronchitis. If you think of your anatomy, the trachea is above the bronchus, which the bronchus are associated with the lungs, the bronchi are associated with the lungs. Then you would code to this condition of tracheobronchitis, you would code it to bronchitis. There is no index or no code specific to tracheobronchitis. We're also given instructional notes to use an additional code where applicable to identify exposure to environmental smoke, exposure to smoke in the perinatal period, a history of tobacco dependence, occupational exposure to environmental smoke where you're working in an environment where you're having exposure to smoke, tobacco dependence, and tobacco use. They are differentiated. This is an instructional note at the beginning of the chapter, so you're not going to find this instructional note with other codes in this chapter. You're going to have to remember that always when you're coding in the respiratory chapter, you're going to have to add these codes to indicate if there's any exposure to tobacco smoke or if there's a patient with tobacco dependence or a history of tobacco dependence or tobacco use. The first guideline has to do with acute exacerbation of chronic obstructive bronchitis and asthma. It does cover both conditions, and our first one we're looking at is just the bronchitis, where the patient has a diagnosis of acute streptococcal bronchitis with acute exacerbation of COPD. I have there the index pathway for those two conditions. You notice that there are codes that are different for the COPD with acute bronchitis and the COPD with exacerbation. And then this is the same guideline, but now we're talking about asthma, exacerbation of moderate persistent asthma with status asthmaticus. Here's your index pathway and the rationale. You notice in the J45 category, the fifth character is what's going to distinguish between uncomplicated cases, acute exacerbation, or status asthmaticus. Status asthmaticus is the more serious of those three. The next guideline, acute respiratory failure as a principal diagnosis. The code for acute and chronic respiratory failure can be assigned as the principal. What it is the condition established after study to be chiefly responsible for occasioning the admission to the hospital, and the selection is supported by the index and the tabular. By supported by, it's talking about those instructional notes. As long as you're following the logic behind the instructional notes, you'd be fine. You have to remember that the chapter-specific coding guidelines, specifically OB, poisoning, HIV, the newborn chapter, they provide sequencing direction, and their sequencing direction would take precedence over you deciding if this acute respiratory failure should be the principal. So you're always reading the guidelines for whatever your patient has wrong with them. If in this case that we've been given, the acute hypoxic respiratory failure is listed as the principal diagnosis, and the COPD with exacerbation would be your secondary diagnosis. Sometimes you can tell what the principal should be based upon your documentation. Other times you have to ask the physician what he or she thinks. Always before you query a physician, if you're working as a coder, get direction from your supervisor to be sure that you're following what standard of practice is in your facility. Acute respiratory failure as a secondary diagnosis. This is when you would use it in those cases where the sequencing tells us what to do. In the case of poisoning, that is going to be your principal diagnosis, and the acute respiratory failure is going to be your secondary. The poisoning code, T40.221 takes precedence. It is the principal diagnosis. The poisoning codes are in Chapter 19, I believe, so we will get to those guidelines later. This is just an example of where you are going to code the respiratory failure, but it's not going to be your principal diagnosis. Next guideline has to do with the sequencing of acute respiratory failure and another acute condition. In this case, the patient has acute pneumococcal pneumonia and acute respiratory failure, both present on admission. So if it wasn't clear which one would be the principal, you might query your physician. But the way we have it listed here, we're going to take the respiratory failure as our principal diagnosis, and then the pneumonia, the pneumococcal pneumonia, J13 category, as our secondary diagnosis. There are not very many 3-character codes in ICD-10-CM. J13 is one of those. This guideline has to do with influenza due to certain identified influenza viruses. You may remember from other podcasts that there are times we code only confirmed cases. HIV is one of those, Zika is another, and here is a third that we're going to be talking about, influenza due to identified novel influenza A virus. Only confirmed cases of this type of virus are coded. And then I go into some of the rationale here on the right. Be sure that you are, when you're reviewing these podcasts, really reading through the rationale. I don't put it there for my benefit. I put it there for your benefit so you understand where the thinking is for why you would choose that code. The next code is ventilator-associated pneumonia developing after admission, where the patient's coming in with pneumonia due to Klebsiella and then develops a superimposed ventilator-associated pneumonia caused by MRSA. MRSA, you may recall, is methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. Here's your pathway on the right, and then I have the rationale. If you have any questions about Chapter 10's coding guidelines, please post them in the discussion board, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you so much, and have a good day.